I was 24 when I realized my father had stopped seeing me as his daughter and started seeing me as a disappointment he couldn't erase. The Carter house sat on the quiet edge of Austin, Texas, a modest two-story home with a yard that always seemed too neat, too staged, like it was trying to cover up the chaos inside. At dinner that night, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Richard Carter. My father sat at the head of the table, still wearing the stiff shirt and tie he had worn all day. He didn't loosen his collar the way most men would when they got home. He liked to remind us he was still in control, even at the dinner table. My mother Linda sat silently across from me, her eyes glued to the casserole she had made as if focusing on it would keep her safe. My brother Brian, 2 years older than me, scrolled through his phone, between bites, smirking at something he didn't care to share. I had been quiet all meal, rehearsing in my head how I would tell them the news. My fingers brushed the edge of the envelope tucked under my plate, the letter that could change everything. I finally took a breath and slid it out. I got the scholarship, full tuition at UCLA, computer science. I tried to keep my voice calm, but I couldn't stop the excitement from spilling through. For a brief second, the room was still. My mom's head lifted slightly, and I saw a flash of something in her eyes, hope, maybe even pride, but it faded just as fast. Brian barely glanced up. And my father laughed. Not the warm kind of laugh. It was sharp cold. Scholarship for what, Emily? For sitting in front of a screen all day, playing with codes like a child playing with Legos. I swallowed hard. It's not just playing, Dad, it's programming. Building systems. This is one of the top programs in the country. He set down his fork with a deliberate clink and leaned back, crossing his arms. Carter women don't chase silly dreams. You will study business, something respectable. Something that leads to a real career, not whatever this is. I felt my face flush. It's not silly. It's the future. That was all it took. He reached across the table, yanked the letter from my hands before I could react. The sound of the paper tearing in half echoed louder than any of us breathing. No daughter of mine is going to waste her time in California learning nonsense. You're going to UT Austin. Business administration. End of discussion. I froze. My mouth went dry. My mom opened her lips as if to say something, but then closed them again, looking down like she always did when he got that tone in his voice. Brian smirked at me. Should have seen that coming, Em. I stood up so fast, my chair scraped the tile. You can't just decide my life for me. My father's eyes darkened, and for a moment I thought he might actually get up. Sit down, Emily. His voice was like ice. No. I clutched the shredded letter. I'm not you. I'm not Brian. I'm not going to live a life you choose just because you're too afraid to let me try. His jaw tightened, and his hand curled into a fist against the table, but he didn't move. I left my plate half finished and walked out, heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. That night, lying awake in my small room at the top of the stairs, I stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine a life outside of those walls. A life where I didn't have to ask for permission to breathe. My grandmother Margaret had given me an old laptop before she passed away, saying I had a mind too sharp to stay dull in this house. That laptop became my escape, my window to the world I wanted. I spent hours coding, teaching myself things no one in this family could even pronounce. When I wrote my first working program at 16, I thought maybe he would finally see I wasn't just some kid messing around. But the night I showed it to him, he barely looked up from the TV and muttered, "Did your grades drop because of this?" No matter how high my grades were, no matter how many achievements I brought home, it was never enough. Nothing I did could compete with Brian. He was the golden boy, the one who followed Dad's blueprint business degree, stable job, the fiancé Dad approved of. Meanwhile, I was the mistake Dad wanted to erase. I thought about my mother too, how her once bright smile had faded over the years. She used to teach art at the elementary school nearby, but Dad convinced her to quit when Brian was born. Said a real Carter wife didn't need to work. She'd lost more than a job that day. She lost her voice. Downstairs, I heard Dad's deep voice rumble through the floorboards talking to Brian about some investment deal, about how proud he was of him. the same words I had never heard directed at me. I curled tighter under the blanket, clutching the shredded pieces of the scholarship letter. I knew then I couldn't keep living like this. The next morning, I came down for breakfast and saw Dad sitting with his coffee, flipping through the newspaper like nothing had happened. Mom moved silently in the kitchen, pouring scrambled eggs onto plates. Brian was already dressed for work, smiling like he belonged here, like he was the chosen one. I sat down and stared at my father. I'm going to reapply to UCLA. I'll find another way to go. He didn't even look up. No, you won't. I clenched my fists. I will. Finally, he raised his eyes to meet mine, and the look in them was a warning. Try it and see what happens. For a moment, nobody spoke. Mom's hand trembled slightly as she set down the orange juice. Brian shifted in his seat, amused. I said nothing else. I just finished my breakfast in silence. But inside, a fire had started. I would leave this house one way or another. That was the last calm day before everything shattered. It was late July, the Texas heat still clinging to the night like a heavy blanket, when I stepped out of the rideshare and walked toward the house. I had stayed later than planned at a tech meetup downtown, soaking in every word from the speakers who actually believed in the future I wanted. For a few hours, I felt like I belonged somewhere, like my dreams made sense to someone. The porch light was on. Through the kitchen window, I saw my father pacing his hand, gripping a coffee mug so tightly I thought it might shatter. My stomach dropped. The moment I opened the door, his voice cut through the air, sharp and venomous. Do you know what time it is? Emily? I froze in the entryway. It was almost 10. I had texted my mom earlier that I'd be late, but of course she wouldn't have told him. I forced my voice to stay calm. I told Mom I was going to a tech conference. I learned about new security software. It could really help me. He slammed the mug on the counter, hot liquid spilling over his hand, but he didn't even flinch. You think sneaking out and staying gone all night makes you grown. You think you can just do whatever you want while you live under my roof. I set my bag down, heart pounding. Dad, I wasn't sneaking. I told Mom. It was for my future. He stepped closer, his eyes cold and glassy. Your future is this family. Everything else is betrayal. Betrayal. My voice cracked. How is learning something new betrayal? Before I could say another word, he grabbed my arm so fast I barely registered the movement. Linda gasped from the corner where she had been quietly washing dishes. Richard, stop. She rushed over, putting herself between us. He shoved her aside with one brutal motion. She stumbled, catching herself on the counter. Brian appeared in the doorway, arms folded, his face unreadable, except for the faintest hint of amusement. You really should know better, Brian said softly, like he was scolding a child. I tried to step back, but my father moved faster. His hand shoved hard against my shoulder, slamming me into the edge of the kitchen counter. The corner hit my ribs with a sickening crack, and the air rushed out of me in one strangled gasp. Pain shot through my chest like fire. I couldn't breathe. My knees buckled and I crumpled to the floor. Linda let out a panicked cry and reached for the phone on the wall. I'm calling 911, she said, her voice trembling. But before she could dial, Richard snatched the receiver from her hand and yanked it out of the base. Don't you dare bring outsiders into this. I lay on the tile, clutching my side, every breath shallow and jagged. Black dots swam in my vision. Mom! I rasped, my voice barely audible. Linda knelt beside me, her hands shaking as she touched my face. Oh God, Emily. Brian shifted his weight by the door, still silent. He didn't move to help. I have to get out, I thought. I can't stay here. With every ounce of strength I had, I crawled toward the back door, dragging myself inch by inch. Each movement sent waves of agony through my chest, but I kept going. My hand found the doorknob, and I pulled myself outside into the humid night air. The neighbor's porch light flicked on. Mrs. Martinez, who lived next door, stepped out with her small dog. She saw me collapsed on the steps, gasping. Emily, sweetheart, what happened? I couldn't answer. She ran over, kneeling beside me. My God, you're hurt. Stay here. I'm calling an ambulance. I heard her voice shouting into her phone, the words blurring together. Sirens echoed faintly in the distance, minutes later growing louder. By then, I was lying flat on my back in the grass, staring at the dark sky, tears streaming silently down my face. When the paramedics arrived, they lifted me gently onto a stretcher. I winced, biting back a scream as they strapped me in. One of them asked what happened. I fell. I whispered the words automatic, instinctive. They didn't press. They loaded me into the ambulance. I caught one last glimpse of my mother standing in the doorway, her face pale and haunted. Behind her, my father stood in the shadows, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The ride to the hospital was a blur. Every bump in the road sent sharp jolts through my ribs. The paramedic kept telling me to breathe slowly, that I was going to be okay. At the ER, bright lights blinded me. Doctors and nurses hovered around taking scans, asking questions. I was too exhausted to think. A middle-aged nurse with kind eyes leaned over me after the x-rays. "You've got 2 fractured ribs, honey. It'll hurt like hell for a while, but you're going to heal." I nodded weakly, even as dread sank deeper into my chest. How do you heal from this kind of pain? Later, after they wrapped my ribs and gave me medication, a police officer stepped into the curtained room. He introduced himself as Officer Hayes, his tone gentle but firm. "Emily, we have to ask, how did this happen?" I hesitated, my throat dry. He looked at me like he already knew, like he had seen this before. Before I could speak, I saw movement behind him. My mother stood there clutching her purse with both hands, her eyes red and swollen. She gave the smallest shake of her head. "Please," her eyes seemed to beg. "Please don't." I swallowed hard. I fell. I was rushing and I tripped on the back steps. The officer's eyes searched mine like he was weighing whether to believe me. He wrote something on his clipboard. "All right, if you remember anything different, call us." He left. Mom stepped closer. "Emily, I'm so sorry. I wanted to call. I wanted to save it." I muttered, my voice raw. She flinched. I turned my face toward the wall, closing my eyes. I didn't want to see her guilt, didn't want to hear the excuses. They discharged me the next afternoon with painkillers and a list of instructions. When Mom came to pick me up, I climbed into the passenger seat silently. The ride back to the house felt like a funeral march. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty now: I wasn't staying. When I finally returned from the hospital, the house felt colder than ever. I was moving slower, every breath sharp with the dull ache of my broken ribs. The doctor had wrapped me up in layers of bandages and ordered weeks of rest, but there was no comfort waiting at home. Richard barely acknowledged me, his face carved in stone, his eyes flickering with the same silent contempt I'd known my entire life. Brian stood in the hallway as I limped past, a cruel smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You know," he said quietly, almost as if he didn't want Linda to hear, "this wouldn't have happened if you knew how to follow the rules." His voice dripped with mock sympathy. "If you don't listen, you get hurt. That's how the world works, Emily." I clenched my jaw, too weak to respond. My arms wrapped tightly around my side. Linda hovered at the edge of the living room, wringing her hands. She wanted to say something, I could see it in her trembling lips, but Richard's presence silenced her like always. That night when the house was finally quiet, she crept into my room with a small envelope. I was sitting on the bed, clutching a pillow to my ribs to ease the pain, when she knelt beside me. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm not strong enough to stop him. I should have." She stopped, choking on the rest of her sentence. She slipped the envelope into my hand. Inside were a few crumpled bills, her secret savings. "Take this, Emily, just in case you need it." Her fingers lingered over mine for a moment before she backed away, her eyes filled with a helpless shame I'd seen too many times. The days crawled by. The bruises turned dark purple, then yellow. Richard didn't say much, but when he did, it was sharp, slicing through the air like a blade. At dinner, he spoke loudly to Linda about how ungrateful children always brought shame to their parents. Brian joined in, pretending he was just joking, but his words were knives. "Maybe next time she'll think twice before acting like she's better than the rest of us." I stared down at my plate, pushing the food around, swallowing back the bitterness rising in my throat. It wasn't long before Richard found a reason to humiliate me publicly. A weekend gathering with extended family turned into a spectacle. I was sitting quietly in the corner of the living room when he suddenly called everyone's attention. "There she is, the daughter who thinks she's too good for her own blood," he announced, his voice loud and full of venom. "She doesn't care about this family, only herself. And what does she bring us in return? Shame. Always shame." The relatives laughed awkwardly, unsure whether to agree or stay silent. I felt their eyes on me, burning my skin, but I didn't move. After everyone left, the tension boiled over. Richard stormed into my room, holding the small suitcase I'd kept by my bed, the one with my few personal things I'd managed to protect. He didn't say a word at first, just ripped it open and dumped its contents onto the floor. Then, without warning, he grabbed the empty suitcase and hurled it into the front yard. "If you want to live your life your way, fine," he roared, his face red with rage. "Get out! Don't come back! This is no longer your home." I froze, my mind spinning. The pain in my ribs made it hard to breathe, but his words made it harder. Linda appeared behind him, tears streaming down her face, pleading softly. "Richard, please, not like this. She's still healing." But he ignored her completely. Brian stepped into the doorway, leaning casually against the frame, his phone in his hand. He raised an eyebrow at me and then smirked. "If you even think about telling anyone what happened," he said, his voice calm and cold, "I'll make sure everyone believes you're a thief. I've got enough texts and little stories to ruin you. Don't test me, Emily." His thumb moved across the screen like he was already drafting the message. I felt my chest tighten, a different kind of pain, now mixing with the physical ache. There was no safety here, no room left for hope or waiting. I bent down slowly, clutching my ribs, and began gathering the things that had been thrown on the floor. Linda hovered nearby, whispering my name, but I couldn't meet her eyes. I stuffed what I could into a small bag, the only one left, and walked past them both without a word. Outside, the evening air was cold, sharp against my skin. The suitcase sat abandoned on the lawn like an accusation. I picked it up with shaking hands and stood there for a long moment, staring at the house I'd once called home. It felt like a stranger's place now, just walls filled with echoes of anger and fear. I knew there was no turning back. I stepped onto the sidewalk, each movement sending waves of pain through my ribs, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a message from Brian. "Remember what I said. Stay quiet, or you'll regret it." I turned the screen off and kept walking, the darkness swallowing me as I left everything I knew behind. The bus ride to Los Angeles felt endless. I spent most of it pressed against the window, my ribs still aching with every turn of the road, my mind looping through everything I had left behind. I had scraped together enough money from the small envelope Linda gave me to buy the cheapest ticket I could find. By the time the bus finally pulled into the terminal in downtown LA, the sun was already dipping behind the skyline, painting the city in streaks of gold and orange. Tina was waiting for me just outside the station. She spotted me before I even saw her and rushed forward, wrapping me in a hug so tight it almost knocked the breath out of me. I winced slightly, my ribs protesting, but I didn't let go. "Emily," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." I shook my head, forcing a weak smile. "Don't. I'm here now." She looked at me for a moment, her eyes scanning the dark circles under mine, the stiffness in the way I moved. Then she nodded like she understood and grabbed my suitcase. "Come on, let's get you settled." The room I ended up renting was little more than a box with peeling paint and a single flickering light bulb. It smelled faintly of mildew, but it was cheap and close to the bus line. I remember sitting on the thin mattress that first night, clutching the small bag of clothes I'd brought, feeling both terrified and oddly free. The next morning, Tina took me to Secure Works LA, where she had gotten me a temporary job doing basic IT support. It was far from glamorous, and the pay was barely enough to cover rent and food, but it was something. During the day, I handled endless help desk tickets, fixing login issues and broken printers for impatient office workers. At night, I stayed up studying advanced programming tutorials, teaching myself everything I could about cybersecurity. Those weeks blurred together into a cycle of exhaustion. I would work long shifts, come home with cheap instant noodles, and eat them while my laptop hummed on the rickety desk. Sometimes I fell asleep with my head still resting on the keyboard, only to wake up with lines from the keys imprinted on my cheek. But despite the fatigue, I felt a spark starting to grow inside me. I was finally in a place where I could learn where no one was hovering over me, telling me it was a waste of time. I started to notice patterns in the work I was doing at SecureWorks problems that small businesses faced when trying to keep their data safe. Most of them couldn't afford enterprise-level solutions, and the ones they did buy were too complicated for non-technical people to use. One night, sitting cross-legged on the floor with my laptop balanced on my knees, the idea hit me. What if there was a security platform that was both powerful and simple? Something built specifically for small businesses. A tool that didn't need a dedicated IT department to manage it. I opened a new document and began typing furiously, sketching out features, user flows, and the core architecture. I called it ShieldNet. It was nothing more than an idea at first, just notes and rough mock-ups, but it felt different. It felt like something that mattered. Tina noticed the change in me. She'd come over after her shifts and find me still awake at 2 a.m, eyes glued to the screen. "Emily, you're going to burn out if you don't sleep," she warned. I smiled tiredly. "I can't stop now. I think this could work." She crouched next to me, resting a hand on my shoulder. "Then promise me something. Whatever you're building, don't let anyone take it from you." I nodded, though I didn't fully understand why her words felt like a warning. Weeks later, I attended a small tech networking event downtown. I almost didn't go because I was so drained from work, but Tina insisted. She handed me a flyer and said, "You need to meet people who get what you're doing. Sitting in this room alone won't get you anywhere." So I went. The event was held in a co-working space filled with mismatched chairs and cheap wine in plastic cups. People clustered in small groups, chatting about startups and new frameworks. I hovered near the edge of the room, unsure where to start, clutching a printout of my basic prototype. That was when I met Adrian Wright. He was standing near the refreshment table, casually sketching something on his tablet. He glanced up, saw me lingering awkwardly, and smiled. "You look like you're debating whether to talk to someone or leave." I laughed softly. "Maybe both." "What are you working on?" he asked. I hesitated for a moment, then pulled out my rough prototype. "It's called ShieldNet. It's a security platform for small businesses. Something easy enough for anyone to use without an IT background." He studied the mock-up intently, his brow furrowing in concentration. "The technology sounds solid, but the interface?" He paused, tilting his head. "It could be more intuitive." My stomach sank. "I know. I'm better with back-end systems. Design isn't my strength." He tapped his pen against the tablet thoughtfully. "What if you handled the back-end and I focused on the UX?" I blinked at him. "Are you saying you want to collaborate?" His smile widened. "If you're serious, yes. I think we could make this work." For the first time in months, I felt a rush of hope strong enough to cut through all the exhaustion. Someone believed in my idea. Someone saw the potential. I shook his hand, my mind already racing with possibilities. We met the next day at a small cafe near Culver City, a quiet spot with worn wooden tables and the smell of fresh coffee in the air. Adrian brought his tablet and a notebook filled with sketches. I brought my laptop and the beginnings of ShieldNet's back-end. He set his things down, leaning forward with an energy that immediately pulled me in. "So tell me everything. How far have you gotten?" I opened the laptop, showing him the basic architecture I had built over the past few weeks. It's secure, lightweight, and scalable. But it looks, well, terrible. He chuckled softly, flipping his tablet toward me. "That's where I come in. Look at this." On the screen was a simple, clean design that made my rough wireframe look like a child's drawing. Clear buttons, minimal menus, and a layout that felt inviting, not intimidating. I stared at it for a long moment. "It's perfect," I whispered. "How did you do that so fast?" He shrugged like it was nothing. "It's what I do. I've worked with enough small businesses to know what confuses them. We'll make it so simple your grandmother could use it. We spent hours brainstorming, refining the concept until it felt alive. For the first time, I wasn't just a girl working in a dim room with ramen cups piling up around me. I was part of something real. The next few months were a blur of work. I kept my job at SecureWorks during the day to pay bills, then met Adrian at night in the shared workspace he rented downtown. We coded until our eyes burned, fueled by cheap coffee and the stubborn belief that we were building something that mattered. Tina would drop by sometimes with takeout, shaking her head at the chaos of wires, screens, and half-empty cups scattered around. "You two are going to forget to eat yourselves into the hospital," she teased, setting down food. But her eyes softened when she looked at me. "I hadn't seen that spark in your face since college. Whatever this is, keep going." The prototype slowly took shape. ShieldNet was no longer just an idea. It was a working product. We tested it with a few local businesses. Adrian had connections with small shops and restaurants who were desperate for affordable security solutions. The feedback was encouraging. But building a product was one thing. Getting people to notice it was another. Adrian suggested we attend a tech meetup in Santa Monica, a bigger event with angel investors known to drop in. I was nervous, but he insisted. "We need people to see this, Emily. If we're going to make it real, we can't hide in a basement forever." That night I stood in a crowded room full of polished startup founders, pitching their apps like they were selling dreams. My hands were clammy as I clutched the laptop with our demo. When it was finally my turn to speak, I kept it simple. ShieldNet is security software designed for small businesses. It's as powerful as enterprise-level tools, but simple enough for anyone to use. We're making protection accessible. A few people nodded politely, but most moved on. I felt the familiar sting of doubt creeping in. Maybe we were too small too late. But then one woman stayed behind after everyone else walked away. She introduced herself as Patricia Lawson. "I know this market," she said calmly, her eyes sharp. "I sold 2 cybersecurity companies before the recession. What you're building, it's needed." I blinked, unsure if I heard her right. "You think so?" She nodded once. "But it needs funding and proper scaling." "Have you thought about investment?" Adrian and I exchanged a glance. We'd talked about it, but it felt too far away, too out of reach. Patricia handed me her card. "Let's set up a meeting. Show me your numbers." When she left, I stared at the card in my hand, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out the noise of the room. That night, back in the tiny apartment, Adrian and I sat on the floor surrounded by papers and notes. "Do you realize what this could mean?" he said, his voice almost a whisper. I nodded slowly. It felt like the first crack of light breaking through a long tunnel. But there was still so much to do. We needed a polished demo, a business plan, and financial projections. And I still had bills to pay, still worked long hours at SecureWorks just to keep the lights on. The exhaustion was deeper now, but so was the determination. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something that could change everything. One evening after a particularly grueling day at work, I came back to the workspace to find Adrian already there sketching out the next version of the interface. He looked up and smiled. "I think we're ready." For a moment I let myself believe it. The following week was a whirlwind of preparation. Adrian and I worked late into the night, fine-tuning every detail of ShieldNet's demo, and building a deck that could actually impress someone like Patricia Lawson. My laptop never left my side, and my phone was full of endless reminders. Refine pitch, double-check financials, prepare talking points. We scheduled the meeting at a sleek, co-working space downtown that Patricia often used for her consultations. On the day of, I woke up early, too anxious to eat. I ironed the only blazer I owned, a thrift store find that somehow still made me feel professional. When Adrian arrived to pick me up, he handed me a cup of coffee and tried to calm me down. "Emily, breathe. She's interested. That's already a good sign." I tried to smile, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. "What if we're not ready?" "We're ready," he said firmly. "Trust me." Patricia was already there when we arrived, sitting at a round table by the window, sunlight catching the silver streaks in her hair. She greeted us with a warm but businesslike smile and gestured for us to sit. "Show me what you've got." I opened the laptop and started the demo. My voice was steady as I explained the architecture, the features, the simplicity that made ShieldNet different from other security products. Adrian followed with a walkthrough of the interface, highlighting how intuitive it was for non-technical users. Patricia asked sharp questions, the kind that made my heart skip. How do you plan to scale support? What about compliance with industry standards? Who are your direct competitors, and why would a small business choose you over them? I answered each one carefully, drawing from every late-night research session and every problem I'd seen small businesses struggle with during my time at SecureWorks. Adrian added insights where design and user experience were concerned. By the end, I could see her expression had shifted. She was no longer just politely listening. She was thinking. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. "You have something here. It's early and you'll need guidance, but it's promising. I'm willing to put in $150,000 for 15% equity." For a moment, I couldn't even process the number. It felt surreal. Adrian blinked, his lips parting like he was about to speak, but Patricia continued. "I'll also connect you with my network. That's the real value here. I can get you in front of clients who will actually pay for this." I swallowed hard, glancing at Adrian. He gave me a small nod. "We're in," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Patricia smiled faintly. "Then let's do this properly. I'll have my lawyer draft the paperwork. Congratulations, you two." When we walked out of that meeting, the sunlight felt different, brighter. For the first time in my life, I had someone outside of my tiny circle who believed in me enough to invest real money. We didn't celebrate right away. Instead, we went back to the workspace and sat quietly for a while. Adrian finally broke the silence. "You realize what just happened, right?" I nodded slowly. "We're no longer just two people building something in the dark." He grinned. "Exactly." The next few weeks moved fast. With Patricia's seed funding, we rented a proper office in a shared startup incubator in Westwood. It was still small, but it had real desks, whiteboards on the walls, and enough space to bring in a part-time developer to help with the workload. I quit my job at SecureWorks, a decision that terrified me, but also felt inevitable. We spent every waking hour building the beta version of ShieldNet, refining it based on feedback from Patricia's contacts. I barely left the office except to grab coffee or crash for a few hours of sleep at the tiny apartment I still shared with two other renters. But there was a new rhythm to my exhaustion now. It wasn't the endless, draining kind I felt back in Texas. It was purposeful. One afternoon, while I was deep in debugging a tricky piece of code, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me pick up. "Emily." My breath caught. It was Linda. "Hi, Mom." There was a pause, then her voice cracked. "I just wanted to hear your voice. I hope you're okay." "I'm fine," I said softly. "I'm in Los Angeles. I'm working on something important." Another pause. "Your father doesn't know I'm calling." I closed my eyes. "Of course he doesn't." "I'm proud of you," she whispered, so quiet I almost didn't hear it. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long moment, emotions swirling in a way I didn't have time to untangle. I set it down and went back to work. There would be time to process later. 2 months after Patricia's investment, we launched ShieldNet's closed beta to a group of 15 small businesses. The feedback was better than we could have hoped. Owners who had been terrified of data breaches told us they finally felt safe. They recommended small tweaks, but overall they loved it. Patricia was true to her word. She introduced us to more potential clients, more investors, even a few journalists. Slowly, word started spreading. Then came the night that would change everything. A well-known tech blogger who specialized in cybersecurity wrote a glowing review of ShieldNet. He called it the security solution small businesses have been waiting for and praised its simplicity and power. By the next morning, our inbox was flooded. Requests for demos, inquiries from potential partners, messages from small business owners desperate for a product like ours. I sat in the office staring at the screen as the numbers climbed, my heart pounding in disbelief. Adrian leaned over my shoulder, his face lit up. We just went from unknown to noticed. I smiled a slow, quiet smile that felt like it had been waiting years to form. The emails kept pouring in. By noon, we had 300 sign-up requests, and by the end of the day, it was over 1,000. My head was spinning as I tried to keep up with the messages replying to potential clients and setting up calls. Adrian was pacing the office, his phone glued to his ear as he coordinated with Patricia on next steps. "We need to scale faster than we planned," he said after hanging up. "We need more servers, more hands, and someone to handle customer onboarding." I nodded, my fingers still flying across the keyboard. "I'll reach out to some freelance developers tonight, maybe even post a listing on the incubator board." That entire week felt like standing in the middle of a storm that was equal parts exhilarating and terrifying. We barely slept, surviving on coffee and adrenaline. Patricia visited the office midweek and walked us through what she called the momentum window. "You have eyes on you now," she said. "If you capitalize on this, ShieldNet can grow faster than you ever imagined. If you hesitate, someone else will fill the gap." So we pushed harder. Within a month, we had onboarded our first 1,000 paying customers. It wasn't just mom-and-pop shops anymore. Small law firms, dental clinics, even a local chain of coffee shops signed up. Revenue was finally coming in enough to cover our expenses and bring in 2 full-time hires. But with growth came new challenges. Support tickets piled up, and we had to scramble to keep response times reasonable. I spent hours on calls with customers, walking them through setup, making notes about what needed fixing. One evening, as I was about to leave the office, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I answered, expecting another business inquiry, but instead heard a voice I hadn't expected. "Emily." I froze. It was Brian. "What do you want?" I said, my tone flat. He chuckled, the sound low and mocking. "Heard you're doing well out there, making a name for yourself. How do you know that?" "Oh, you'd be surprised who still keeps tabs on you. Dad showed me some article about your little company. Guess you're not completely useless after all." My grip on the phone tightened. "What's your point?" His voice dropped. "The point is, don't forget where you came from. It'd be a shame if certain stories got out." I took a slow breath. "You think you can still scare me?" Brian laughed. "Think about it. Who would people believe? A girl who ran away, or the family she abandoned?" Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the phone in my hand. My chest tightened, not with fear exactly, but with a deep, simmering anger. I wasn't that girl anymore. He couldn't touch me now. The next day, I poured myself into work with renewed focus. ShieldNet was growing too fast for me to waste energy on ghosts from Texas. Adrian noticed my distraction but didn't push. By the end of the quarter, we had over 5,000 customers. Patricia organized a small investor dinner in Beverly Hills to introduce us to potential Series A backers. I remember standing in that elegant restaurant surrounded by polished executives in tailored suits, and feeling like I had stepped into someone else's life. One of the investors, a sharp-eyed man named Derek Sullivan, leaned in during the dinner and said, "You know, Emily, companies like yours often get acquisition offers once they hit a certain threshold. Have you thought about an exit?" I forced a polite smile. "Right now, we're focused on growth." Adrian nodded beside me, his expression unreadable. After the dinner, as we rode back in an Uber, he finally asked, "Would you ever consider selling?" I stared out the window at the city lights blurring past. "Not yet. I want to see how far this can go." He smiled faintly. "Good. Me too." 2 weeks later, an email landed in my inbox from a corporate address I didn't recognize. The subject line simply read, "Strategic Opportunity." I opened it and scanned the message. It was from the VP of Business Development at Fortress Tech, one of the largest enterprise security companies in the country. They wanted to meet. I showed the email to Adrian, my voice trembling slightly. "This is big." He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "They don't just talk. If Fortress Tech is reaching out, they're serious." Patricia joined us for the meeting a week later. Fortress Tech's headquarters were in a towering glass building in San Francisco, the kind of place that screamed power and money. We were escorted into a sleek conference room overlooking the bay. The VP greeted us warmly, then got straight to the point. "We've been watching ShieldNet. Your penetration into the small business market is impressive. It complements areas where we've struggled." I exchanged a quick glance with Adrian. They spent the next hour asking detailed questions about our tech stack, user growth, and roadmap. Then, almost casually, the VP said, "We'd like to acquire ShieldNet." I felt my breath hitch, but I kept my face neutral. "What kind of numbers are you thinking?" "2 million. Adrian's eyes flickered, but he stayed silent. Patricia leaned back in her chair, her lips pressed together. "Thank you for the offer," I said carefully. "But we believe ShieldNet is just beginning to show its potential." The VP smiled thinly. "Think it over. The offer stands for 2 weeks." On the flight back to Los Angeles, Adrian finally spoke. "2 million is insulting. We're already generating almost that much in annual run rate." I nodded, staring out at the clouds. But the fact that they're interested means others will be too. And he was right. Within days of declining, 2 more companies reached out with similar inquiries. ShieldNet wasn't just a scrappy startup anymore. We were on the map. I could feel it in my bones. Something much bigger was coming. The next morning started with a call from Patricia. Her tone was calm but firm, the way she always sounded when there was something serious on her mind. "Fortress Tech's offer was a test," Emily said. "They wanted to see how you'd react. Declining was the right move. But now you need to prepare because other players will come knocking." After the call, Adrian and I sat in the office staring at the whiteboard filled with our plans. He tapped his pen against the table, deep in thought. "We need to solidify our next feature set. If we're going to keep growing, we can't just ride this wave." I nodded, still replaying Patricia's words in my head. "Let's focus on automated compliance reporting. It's what mid-sized businesses are struggling with. If we nail that, we open up a whole new market." So we got back to work, days and nights blending again. New hires joined our team, bringing fresh energy and more chaos to our once quiet office. The noise didn't bother me. It was the sound of something alive. 2 weeks later, Patricia called again with another development. "Privacy Guard, the industry giant, wants to meet." "They're serious, Emily. If Fortress Tech was a test, this is the real thing." I felt my stomach tighten. Privacy Guard was the name everyone in cybersecurity respected. If they were interested, it meant ShieldNet had become more than just a blip on the radar. The meeting was scheduled at their Silicon Valley headquarters, a sprawling campus that felt more like a tech utopia than a corporate office. Adrian and I flew out the night before, both of us unusually quiet during the trip. When we arrived, we were escorted into a simple but elegant office. The man waiting for us was James Wilson, the CEO himself. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I've followed ShieldNet closely," he said, his gaze sharp but not unkind. "You've built something remarkable in a very short time." I thanked him, keeping my voice steady, despite the racing of my heart. He leaned forward slightly. "We've struggled to create a product that truly serves small to mid-sized businesses. Your approach solves that gap. We want to acquire ShieldNet and bring you and your team into Privacy Guard as a new division." There was a pause before Adrian asked, "What does that look like?" James answered without hesitation. 75 million, 60 in cash, 15 in stock options vesting over 3 years for you and Adrian. You'd lead the division yourselves with full resources and support." The room felt suddenly very still. 75 million. The number echoed in my mind, almost too large to comprehend. I kept my expression neutral. "We'll need time to consider. Of course, take a week. But understand, this isn't just about money. This is about expanding the impact of what you've built." On the flight back to Los Angeles, neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, Adrian turned to me. "What are you thinking?" I stared out the window, watching the clouds blur beneath us. "This isn't just an acquisition. It's a chance to scale beyond anything we could do alone." He nodded slowly. "I know, but it's also giving up control." I sighed. "I don't see it as giving up. I see it as expanding the vision." Back in LA, we met with Patricia and our small board to weigh the options. She laid it out plainly. "You can keep growing independently, but it will take years to reach what Privacy Guard can offer you in months. And you're in a market where speed matters. The decision didn't come overnight. I spent nights pacing my apartment, thinking about the girl who left Texas with nothing but a suitcase. I thought about the nights spent eating instant noodles over my laptop, about Brian's mocking voice, about Richard's cold stare as he told me I'd never amount to anything. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about what I wanted to build, the life I wanted to live. When we finally called James Wilson to give him our answer, my voice was calm. We're ready to move forward. The acquisition closed 6 weeks later. Overnight, everything changed. My bank account showed a number I couldn't have imagined just a few years earlier. I moved out of my cramped apartment and into a modern condo in Malibu with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean. But more than the money, it was the feeling of validation that stayed with me. ShieldNet was no longer just my dream. It was part of something bigger. Adrian and I transitioned into our new roles at Privacy Guard smoothly. We had a larger team, more resources, and the freedom to focus on strategy instead of constant firefighting. One evening after a long day of meetings, I stood on my new balcony with a glass of wine. The sun was setting over the Pacific, turning the water gold. My phone buzzed with a text from Linda. I saw the news. "I'm so proud of you." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "Thank you, Mom." Almost immediately another message came. "Your father. He knows too." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. That night, as I looked out at the endless horizon, I realized something. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just another beginning. It was early 2022 when everything shifted again. ShieldNet had grown beyond anything I could have imagined. 5,000 businesses relied on our platform, from small dental clinics to regional law firms. We had become the go-to security solution for companies that couldn't afford enterprise-level systems, but needed the same level of protection. One Monday morning, as I sipped my coffee in the Malibu condo, my phone buzzed with an email from Patricia. The subject line read, "Privacy Shield wants to talk." My heart skipped. Privacy Shield was the biggest player in the cybersecurity industry, bigger even than Fortress Tech. Later that afternoon, we sat in the boardroom at Privacy Shield's Los Angeles satellite office. James Walker himself, a legend in the industry, walked in with a quiet confidence that filled the room. He greeted Adrian and me with a firm handshake, then went straight to the point. "We have been following ShieldNet closely. You've captured a market segment no one else has touched successfully. We want to bring you into Privacy Shield and give your technology the resources to scale globally." I held my breath as he slid a folder across the table. Inside was the offer. $85 million. Adrian blinked, then looked at me. I could see the same shock and calculation running through his mind. James continued, "This isn't just an acquisition. We want you, Emily, to lead a new division under Privacy Shield, focusing on small and mid-sized businesses. Adrian would remain head of user experience. You'd have full autonomy but access to all our infrastructure." I closed the folder slowly, my fingers trembling. That evening, Adrian and I sat on the balcony of my condo, the ocean glowing in the fading sunset. He stared at the horizon, his voice quiet. 85 million. That's life-changing. I nodded, still trying to process. It's not just the money, it's the reach. Imagine ShieldNet deployed worldwide, not just in the States. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. But it's also the end of our independence. I leaned back in my chair. Maybe. Or maybe it's the next chapter. We didn't decide that night, or the next. For days we went back and forth, making lists of pros and cons, talking to Patricia, talking to our team. Some wanted to keep building on our own. Others were ready for the stability and resources a giant like Privacy Shield could offer. Finally, after a long week of sleepless nights and endless conversations, we called James Walker. "We're ready," I said. The deal closed in late spring. After taxes and equity distributions, I walked away with $35 million in my account. Adrian got his share, and every single member of our original team received a generous payout. Seeing their faces light up when we told them was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. The press exploded with the news. Tech blogs ran headlines like, "The Startup That Changed Small Business Security," and "From Scrappy Founders to Multi-Million-Dollar Exit." But one headline in particular caught my breath. "From Runaway Daughter to Tech Millionaire Emily Carter's Unbelievable Journey." The story spread quickly, faster than I expected. Reporters dug into my past, into the small Texas town I grew up in. They uncovered the police report from the hospital visit years ago, even though I hadn't pressed charges. They interviewed neighbors, classmates, even some of Dad's former coworkers. And just like that, my family's secret wasn't a secret anymore. Back in Austin, Richard faced the fallout. His coworkers at the construction firm whispered behind his back. Old friends stopped returning his calls. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid him. One evening, a local news station aired a segment about the father who drove his daughter away, only to see her succeed beyond his reach. They played an old photo of me in my high school graduation gown, next to a current shot of me at a tech conference. I heard later from Mom that the shame was unbearable for him. At work, people openly mocked him. A former colleague told the press about his temper, about the way he used to belittle everyone in meetings. Soon after, the company's HR department opened an investigation into his past behavior. 2 weeks later, he was fired. Mom called me late one evening, her voice shaking. "Emily, they let your father go. He's not taking it well." I sat in silence, staring out at the moonlit waves. Part of me felt a grim sense of closure, like the universe had finally balanced the scales. But another part of me ached for her, trapped in the fallout of his choices. "Is he safe?" I asked. "I think so, but he's angry. At himself, at the world, at you." I closed my eyes. I didn't ask for this. I know. The next day, an Austin paper ran another headline: "Former foreman fired amid allegations of domestic abuse." My father's name was in bold letters. For the first time in years, Brian reached out. His text was short and sharp. "You think you won. You ruined his life." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. He ruined his own life. I didn't hear from him again. Back in Los Angeles, life moved on. I stepped into my new role as Director of Privacy Shield Small Business Solutions. The resources were incredible, the team larger and more capable than anything I'd ever had before. But late at night, in the quiet of my home, I couldn't stop thinking about the ripples my success had sent back to that small house in Texas. It wasn't regret exactly. It was more complicated than that. One morning, a week after the Austin headlines, I woke up to another message from Mom. Just 3 words: "He wants to talk." I set the phone down, staring at the ocean beyond my window. For years I had imagined this moment. Him coming to me, needing something. But now that it was here, I didn't know what to feel. I wasn't sure if I wanted to open that door. I sat there, staring at the email for what felt like hours. The subject line was simple, almost hollow. "Come home." The body of the message was even shorter. "I was wrong. I need your help. Please." For years I had imagined a moment like this, a crack in Richard's pride. But I never thought it would feel so empty. Still, something in me stirred. Not pity, but a quiet acknowledgement that this chapter wasn't closed yet. I booked a flight to Austin a few days later. It had been nearly a decade since I left. As the plane descended, I looked out the window at the familiar sprawl of the city that had once felt like a prison. The air was warm and thick-heavy, with a nostalgia I didn't ask for. The restaurant Richard chose was a modest family-owned place near downtown. I arrived early, wanting to steady myself before facing him. When Linda walked in, her face looked tired but soft. She hugged me tightly, whispering, "You look beautiful, Emily." Then I saw him. Richard walked in slowly, his posture stooped, the sharpness in his eyes dulled. He wore an old blazer that hung loose on his thinner frame. Behind him was Brian, looking older too, his confidence chipped away. We sat at a corner table. Richard's hands trembled as he reached for his water. For a moment, no one spoke. Then he cleared his throat, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard. "I lost my job. The bank is taking the house. Your brother—" He glanced at Brian, who stared down at his hands. "He's had trouble." "And your mother?" "I'm fine," Linda cut in softly. her eyes darting to me. But things aren't good. We didn't know who else to ask. I looked at Brian. He didn't meet my eyes. Instead, he muttered, "Chloe left. I got caught in a bad deal. The company fired me." I turned back to Richard. "So now you're here asking me for help?" He swallowed hard. "I know I don't deserve it. I was wrong. I see that now. Please, I need you." Memories flashed in my mind the night he broke my ribs. The cold silence when he told me to leave the years of scorn that carved scars I still carried. I looked at him and felt nothing like the fear I once did. Only clarity. When I needed a home, I said quietly, "You threw me out." When I asked for understanding, you mocked me. You made sure I had nothing. And now you're asking me to save the house you chose over me. Richard's lips trembled. I was proud. I thought I was teaching you strength. I see now it was cruelty. Please, Emily, I'm not asking for me. I'm asking for your mother. She has nowhere to go. I turned to Linda. Her eyes were wet, pleading, but not demanding. "I don't want to stay there," she said softly. "I just want a place where I can breathe." I reached into my bag and pulled out a black credit card, sliding it across the table toward her. "This is for you. Find a new place. Somewhere safe. Somewhere that feels like yours. Start over." Linda took the card with trembling hands, whispering, "Thank you." Richard's voice cracked. "And me?" I held his gaze. "No. You made your choice. You didn't just fail me, you destroyed every bridge you could have crossed back to me. I can help her. But you, Richard, will live with what you did." His face paled, the weight of those words settling on his shoulders like a final sentence. He lowered his head, and for the first time in my life, I saw him break. His hands clenched on the table, his shoulders shaking. Brian finally spoke, his voice low and bitter. "You're going to leave him like this. He's still our father." I turned to him. "He was your father. Mine died the night he told me I wasn't his daughter anymore." No one spoke after that. The silence was heavy, filled with things that could never be unsaid. I stood leaning down to kiss Linda on the cheek. "Call me when you find a place," I whispered. I walked out of that restaurant into the warm Austin air, leaving behind the man who once ruled my world with fear. Through the glass window, I saw Richard still sitting there, hunched and silent, his eyes red, but his mouth closed. He didn't even try to stop me. As I stepped into the waiting car, I felt a strange calm wash over me. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't revenge. It was simply release. The past no longer had any hold on me. Back at the hotel that evening, I received a message from Linda. Just 2 words: "Thank you." I put my phone down and stared out at the fading sunset. For the first time, Austin didn't feel like a shadow. It felt like a chapter I had finally finished. The next morning, I boarded my flight back to Los Angeles. I had no plans to return. The flight back to Los Angeles felt lighter than I expected. When the plane landed, the familiar ocean breeze greeted me as if it had been waiting all along. My driver took me straight to the Malibu house, where the glass walls opened to endless views of the Pacific. For the first time, it truly felt like home. In the days that followed, Austin became nothing more than a memory. I didn't look back, but word still reached me. Brian filed for bankruptcy. Whatever money he had left vanished in the aftermath of his failed deals. Chloe didn't return. He sold what little he owned and quietly moved out of Austin, disappearing into a new city where no one knew his name. Richard stayed in the old house now, nearly empty. The neighbors had grown colder, avoiding him completely. They left unsigned letters on his doorstep, reminding him of the daughter he had hurt. Local papers ran follow-up stories about the disgraced father of a tech mogul rehashing the hospital visit, the whispers of abuse that everyone had ignored for years. The bank finally posted a foreclosure notice. I didn't call. Meanwhile, other names from my past began to crumble. Evelyn Stone, the woman who had once treated me like a naive outsider, was exposed for fraudulent accounting practices at Stone Tech. Within weeks, the company collapsed under federal investigation. Ryan, the smooth-talking CEO who had tried to exploit my early work, was arrested for defrauding multiple startups. I watched the headlines from a distance, feeling no glee, just a quiet sense of the universe aligning itself. But I didn't want my life to revolve around what had fallen apart. I wanted to build. So I created Shield Foundation. The idea came to me one sleepless night, a nonprofit that would provide grants, mentorship, and safe housing for women escaping domestic violence, as well as scholarships for young women in tech. The first time I stood in front of a room full of survivors, telling them that they were stronger than they believed, I felt something inside me shift. Linda moved in with me for a while. She arrived with just a single suitcase, her posture uncertain, but her eyes softer than I had seen in years. I showed her the studio I had set up, a sunny room overlooking the ocean with easels, brushes, and endless blank canvases. She stood there quietly, running her fingers over the wooden frame of a canvas. "I used to dream about this," she whispered, "painting without anyone telling me it was a waste of time." "Then do it," I said. "This space is yours." In the weeks that followed, Linda began to paint again. Her first piece was a simple seascape, soft blues and golds blending into a horizon. She spent hours in that room humming softly to herself. Sometimes I would walk past the door and hear her laughing under her breath, a sound I had almost forgotten. One evening I came home from a board meeting to find her sitting on the terrace watching the sunset with a glass of wine. Her face was calm, her smile unforced. I joined her, sitting quietly as the sky turned shades of pink and orange. "I can't remember the last time I felt this at peace," she said. I reached over and took her hand. "You deserve it. You've always deserved it." She turned to me, her eyes glistening, but not from sadness this time. "I should have protected you. I should have been stronger. You were strong in the ways you could be," I said gently. "And now we're both free." She smiled, then really smiled, and it was like seeing a part of her that had been locked away finally step into the light. The foundation grew faster than I expected. We opened partnerships with shelters in Los Angeles, then Austin, then beyond. I funded programs that offered coding classes for young girls from underprivileged communities. I spoke at universities, conferences, and community centers. Every time I told my story, I saw someone in the audience whose eyes filled with recognition, someone who needed to know they weren't alone. One Saturday afternoon, Linda finished a new painting and called me into the studio. It was a portrait of two women standing side by side, their hands intertwined with the ocean stretching endlessly behind them. "It's us," she said. I stepped closer and felt tears sting my eyes. She had captured something I didn't know could be seen, our resilience, our healing. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her close. For years we had been bound by silence and pain. Now, in this house filled with light and possibility, we were bound by something new. "I love you, Mom," I whispered. She leaned into me, her voice soft and certain. "I love you too, Emily." As we stood there, the weight of the past felt lighter, like it no longer had the power to pull us down. Outside, the waves crashed gently against the shore, a reminder that life moved forward, always reshaping itself, always carving new paths. And for the first time, I truly believed that the cycle was broken. The waves outside my Malibu home shimmered in the morning light, casting golden reflections on the glass walls. I stood barefoot on the cool floor, holding a cup of tea, feeling the quiet hum of peace around me. The scent of salt water drifted in as I watched a sailboat in the distance, its white sails catching the breeze. Life had finally settled into something steady and calm, something I had never imagined for myself back in those dark years. Michael came into the room, his tie slightly loose, holding a stack of papers for the STEM workshop we were hosting later. He smiled when he saw me gazing out at the ocean. "You're in your head again, aren't you?" he teased gently. I laughed softly, setting my tea down. Just thinking about how far everything has come. That afternoon, we drove to a community center in Los Angeles where dozens of children from underserved schools were waiting. The Shield Foundation had grown far beyond what I envisioned. We were funding safe shelters for women, creating scholarships for young girls in tech, and now hosting workshops where kids could explore science and technology without limits. I watched a little girl named Amara stare wide-eyed at a simple coding program. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed her first line of code, and when it worked, her entire face lit up. She turned to me beaming and said, "I didn't know I could do this." I knelt beside her and told her the truth. "You can do anything. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Moments like that reminded me why I kept going, why all the pain had been worth something greater than revenge. A week later, I took a quiet trip to Austin. There was one last visit I needed to make. The cemetery was still and quiet, with rows of simple headstones stretching across the green lawn. I carried a small bouquet of lilies and knelt in front of my grandmother's grave. The letters on the stone were weathered but still clear: Margaret Hill. I placed the flowers down carefully, my fingers brushing the cool stone. For a while I just stood there listening to the wind move through the trees. Then I spoke softly. "Grandma, you were right. I built something wonderful. And I finally learned to live free." I stayed until the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the grass before walking back to the car. When I returned to Malibu, Linda was waiting in the studio with another painting, this one of a sunrise over calm waters. She had painted two figures standing on the shore together, their silhouettes peaceful and strong. It was us. She looked up and smiled, the kind of smile I hadn't seen since I was a child. For the first time, I truly felt the weight of the past dissolve. In the evenings now, I sit on the terrace with Michael and Mom, the sound of the waves below filling the silence with something soothing. There is no more fear, no more proving my worth to people who never saw it. There is only this moment and the many more to come. I have learned that healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about transforming it into something that no longer holds power over you. My life is no longer about what Richard did, or what Brian said, or who tried to break me. It is about what I chose to build from the ashes they left behind. And to anyone out there listening to my story, who is still trapped in pain or betrayal, know this. You are not defined by what someone did to you. You are not broken beyond repair. You have the power to write a new chapter, to turn your wounds into strength, and your silence into a voice that matters. If you've lived through darkness and found your way back to the light, share your story. You never know whose hope you might ignite. And if you're still in that darkness, hold on. Your story isn't over yet. Stay with me here, because together we'll keep proving that even the deepest scars can lead to something beautiful.